the impacts on local trails. My name is Eveline, a volunteer with AARP New Hampshire. Please note this event is being recorded. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping tips. In an effort to eliminate background noise, please be sure to mute your line by ensuring that your microphone icon has a red line through it. If you have a comment or question, please use the chat box, which can be accessed by clicking the chat button, and my fellow volunteer Iris will raise your question for you. Approximately 45 million Americans are age 65 or older. By 2030, that number will reach 73 million Americans. At that point, fully 1 in 5 Americans will be older than 65. By 2034, the United States will, for the first time ever, be a country comprised of more older adults than of children. AARP supports the efforts of neighborhoods, towns, cities, and rural areas to be great places for people of all ages. We believe that communities should provide safe, walkable streets, age-friendly housing and transportation options, and then also to access and needed services, and then to provide opportunities for residents of all ages to participate in community life. Our presenter this evening is Beth Fenstermacher. Beth is the Assistant City Planner for the City of Concord. In addition to reviewing development within the city, she staffs the Conservation Commission and oversees the management of Concord's trail system with the Trails Subcommittee. She has trained with Leave No Trace, an organization for the ethical use of the outdoors, and she is an avid user of the trails. So we hope that you'll enjoy this session. Beth, take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and go just through a PowerPoint so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. So this is sort of a second in the series of what I presented a few weeks ago, sort of introducing everybody to the trail system within Concord itself. And this expands upon some of the Leave No Trace principles that I discussed during that discussion. So this is just, for those that weren't there, it's a map of the city of Concord, and it shows all of the trails that we have. So all those red squiggly lines that you see on this map are the trail systems that are found on open spaces and conservation lands throughout the city. Even just looking at those red squiggly lines, you can see how much open space and conservation land that we have within the city, which is a great resource outside of the urban core. And it's something that the city protected these lands for not only the recreational use, but the primary protection was either for watershed or wildlife or some sort of ecological purposes for conserving that land from development. So the trails are protected by some ordinances that prohibit uses, motorized vehicles, camping, fires, littering, but those are just things that are, police could enforce or some trail ranger could enforce, but it doesn't really get to the root of trying to reach people in their ethical use of the outdoors. There's a difference between telling somebody not to do it and trying to educate people about why they should not be doing it to protect these resources. So that's what we're trying to do over the next year or so, is get more information and education out to all the trail users. With COVID-19, our trail use has exploded. Any day you go to some of our more popular trails, the parking lots are overflowing with people, which is great, but at the same time, it's really starting to burden the resource. So we're trying to get as much information out there as possible. So this presentation tonight is one of those steps. And I'm hoping that some of you can be ambassadors for treating our properties a little more ethically and preserving these spaces for the future generations to use. So just a real quick snapshot of the Leave No Trace principles. I'll go through these really quickly, and then I'm going to go through some slides that are information about Leave No Trace, and then just go a little more specifically about some issues that we see specifically on Concord trails. So There are 7 principles for ethical outdoor use. Plan ahead and prepare, and that's just make sure you know where you're going, you bring the right equipment, food, and make sure that you're safe out there. Travel on durable surfaces. Again, that's for your safety, but it's also for preserving the resource of the soils that you're walking on. If it's not a durable surface, you could potentially cause erosion, rocks to fall, the dirt to sort of start to wash away. So you really want to stay on those durable surfaces. Also staying on marked trails. That's when we're planning the trails, we're often choosing areas that are more or less erodible. So if you're staying on the marked trails, you know it's a safe place to go and it's not going to disturb the habitat and it's going to be a safe footing for you. Dispose of waste properly. This is probably one of the biggest things. It is a carry in, carry out program for the city. We don't have trash cans at any of the trailheads. So we ask you, whatever you bring in, bring it home with you, including dog waste. And the trails are maintained primarily by volunteers. So we ask if you see anything that you feel safe picking up and bringing out with you that other people have left behind. If you see any along the trails, pick it up and take it out. And that's a huge help for us. Leave what you find. So this is, again, to preserve the wildlife and the plants that are out there for future generations. So you can take pictures, but just keep on walking and leave it there. Respect wildlife, and I'll go through some impacts to wildlife that trail use can have later on. We are sharing those spaces with them. As we grow and develop more in the city, they're running out of places to go. Someone was just mentioning a bear in their backyard. That's what happens when we start to overdevelop. We're taking away their home, so they start invading ours. But if we have this sort of mutual respect, they'll stay away and keep everybody safe, hopefully. Being considerate of others. All of our trails are multi-use trails. So, you may run into someone on a bicycle or horseback or people with dogs. And we just ask that everybody work together to make it an enjoyable experience for everyone. And then respect private property that surrounds the trails. Again, being out there is a privilege. It's not necessarily always a right. And we want to make sure that we have good relationships with all our abutters. And some of the trails actually go through private property where they've just given us an easement for that 6-foot trail. So just stay on the trails and respect those people. So Leave No Trace. So what is it? It's an organization. It's nationwide. It started back in the 70s. It was actually something that came out of the National Park Service, but eventually that program started to die off and it was no longer a government-run agency. And it was something that was found to be very important to spread the word of ethical use of the outdoor spaces. So nonprofit organizations partnered with not only government agencies, but local organizations, small government, just to make sure that this information is getting out there. So it's an educational resource. And they produce those 7 guiding principles, but they also produce a lot of educational material and do a lot of training just to make sure that these resources remain useful for everybody into the future. So their mission statement is it's a national movement dedicated to protecting the outdoors and inspire people to enjoy it responsibly. So their mission is to teach people. So education is a huge part of it and inspiring people to use it responsibly. So it may get a little preachy over time, but it's just trying to reach to that the reason that you're out there, the reason that you're enjoying the outdoors, there's a reason for that. So they want to make sure that everybody has that same experience. And if we all do it responsibly, we can continue to do that. So it initially started for sort of larger, more outdoor enthusiasts, but it can really be scaled down and geared towards anybody that wants to be outdoors. Anybody that has any relationship with nature, even if you're just gardening or enjoying outdoor spaces in your neighborhood. So it seems like a national big movement. And some of their information is specific to, through hikers or mountain hikers, but we can kind of whittle it down and make it applicable to a city level or a small local trail level. So I'm going to go through some statistics of why is it important to minimize our impacts on the outdoors. So some big numbers of sort of the nationwide, America pays $2.9 billion to fight fires in parks and forests. 80% of which are caused by campfires left unattended or negligently discarded cigarettes. So that human impact, it's almost $3 billion every year of forest fires just because people are not being responsible. Wildlife in our parks are routinely relocated, in often cases euthanized due to conflicts with humans. The National Park Service cites human garbage as the origin of many of these unfortunate and unnecessary conflicts. The Grand Canyon National Park has $11 million in trail maintenance needs, and more than $5 million in critical trail work is needed in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So these are pretty big numbers. Wildlife that obtain human food can lose their fear of humans and develop attraction behaviors to trails, picnic areas, campsites, and visitors. And it turns wild animals into aggressive and potentially dangerous panhandlers. Again, many of these animals ultimately can be euthanized by land managers because of their risks they present to people. Regarding vegetation in these wild areas, invasive species are being spread nationwide due to moving firewood from one area to the next. So the city of Concord right now, we're losing all of our ash trees. And one of the reasons why is the emerald ash borer is an insect. It's an invasive insect from outside of the country, and it's being moved by logs. So some firewood that was brought into the area, and it's pervasive and has spread throughout the city, and it's starting to spread throughout the state, and it's killing off all of our ash trees. Within the next 5 years, we won't have any more ash trees, at least within the city of Concord, which is extremely devastating. Right now, there's a ban on where you can get your firewood in a lot of locations because they don't want to bring any of these invasive pests into other areas to cause such devastation. So that's something that to really consider if, not necessarily on the local level of hiking, but if you're camping or bringing firewood or anything, something to think about. Trash, as far as people that are disposing, there was a talk before we started about people going out and picking up trash that others have left behind. So if you think of how long they last out there, grocery bags can last up to 20 years, aluminum cans can last up to 100 years, and fishing line can last up to 600 years, which is crazy. Even orange peels take 6 months to decompose. So those will be out, if you're throwing orange peels or banana peels, those can take up to 1 to 2 years to decompose. So if you're thinking, oh, it's natural, it'll decompose, it's going to be there almost a year later. So is that really an ethical use or ethical disposal when you can take it home and dispose of it properly instead of leaving it there for potentially causing a nuisance or bringing wildlife in to investigate what that orange peel is? You're starting to introduce them to these more human inhabited areas and causing those animals to become nuisance when they wouldn't necessarily on their own come there to look for that food. And studies have attributed pet waste, so dog waste, in instances of water pollution, sufficient enough to cause exceed water quality standards, especially close to beaches, and they could potentially harm wildlife. And I'll go through that information a little bit later. And recovery rates for areas impacted by recreation are often very slow, with restoration to natural conditions often requiring a minimum of 10 to 30 years. So there's pretty big impacts that are out there. So leave no trace principles following those is one of the best ways to minimize these issues that are being found through all the studies that are happening in parks and forests throughout the country. And these are ways to minimize those impacts that we start to see in the outdoors today. So when venturing outdoors, humans generally impact the environment in 7 broad areas. So there's wildlife impacts, there's disturbance, so just you being there can alter their behavior, either how you smell or your movement, it starts to scare them. One instance is there's, I don't know if anybody's been to Broken Ground Trails off of Curtisville Road in Concord. There used to be heron nests that people would always see herons. We have great pictures. We built new trails out there, not along the beaver pond where the herons were, but because people were walking and creating their own trails to see the heron nest, they started to create these trails, and a lot of people went down there. And last year was the first year in decades that herons did not nest there. So that behavior of introducing all those people there has now disturbed their habitat, and they're no longer coming back. So that's a pretty huge impact, especially considering there's not a lot of locations like that in an urban environment. And there's soil impacts. So the loss of organic litter, which is important, sort of that leaf litter, that's what regenerates that soil and keeps it healthy for the forest floor. So by walking on it or kicking it, often mountain bikers will bring out their leaf blower in clear trails or clear areas where they want to go. So you're disturbing that natural cycle of the forest floor, and you're really impacting the soils there. You're causing soil compaction or soil erosion, and that impacts how water is moving through the site and maybe start creating flooding or gullying where it normally would not have happened. There's vegetation impacts. So you start to lose vegetation. As I mentioned before, the introduction of invasive species or tree or plant damage. Human waste, if people are, urinating on plants, animals will be attracted to that, and some will start to defoliate because of the salt in your urine. So they recommend, if you do need to go out, use the facilities out in the woods, that you go on a rock or gravel surface and not on vegetation, because it will not cause animals to come and start to defoliate those plants. So even these minor little things start to have impacts. There's cultural and resource impacts. There's been a lot of theft or damage to cultural or historic features and artifacts. There's not as much that you'll find around here, but definitely out west in the Native American locations, there's a lot more impacts to the cultural artifacts that have remained out there. Campfire impacts. We don't allow campfires on private property here. Public property in Concord, but if you're going somewhere, state parks or anywhere, there can be large damaging fires. We had people do have them, even though they're illegal. It's about 5 years ago off of Long Pond or Lakeview Drive, near almost up towards Carter Hill Orchard. There was kids that were partying in the woods. They left a fire. They didn't put it out, and it caused a 60-acre forest fire. So the trees that did survive then are starting to die now. We're starting to see 5 years later. So they completely devastated 60 acres of conservation land because they didn't put out their campfire. So huge impact. There's water resource impacts from sedimentation, that soil erosion from compaction. People that are walking down to water's edge, the more compaction, vegetation stops growing. You can kind of see in this image, you can see how close they are to this water. That's not a natural shoreline. So it starts to impact the water quality and starts to degrade any shorelines. And then there's social impacts from other visitors. So overcrowding, conflicts between various user groups, and diminished outdoor experience. And that is something that I've heard a lot, not just within Concord, but the White National Forest had huge issues with this in other state parks over the past year. Nobody could go anywhere, so they were flooding the outdoors, which was wonderful, but it was causing so many user conflicts just because so many people aren't educated on how to use the outdoors, and some people are so used to being the only ones out there, and it definitely caused user conflicts. So using the land ethically really starts to help with these conflicts. So if you think about the number of people that you see on public lands each year, it's great that so many people spend time outdoors, but there's so many more opportunities to impact the outdoors. Recreation related impacts to public lands are individual, but they're cumulative over time. So it's not the one time someone cuts a switchback or tosses an apple core off the trail. It's when these actions are repeated hundreds, thousands, or millions of times. So, if you're looking at the state park system, almost 800 million people each year are using the state park system. That's a lot, and that's a lot of impact. But that's also our conservation land that we're relying on for ecological benefits, for wildlife, for our water quality, for our air quality. So the environmental implications of outdoor use can be staggering, especially given the popularity of outdoor recreation on federal, state, and local lands. And this is just sort of a graphic image. You see this lovely open park along the water. You start to invite some people, and then more people show up, and then you start to see the litter, the grass starts to be impacted. So it really starts to impact the more people that are coming out there. It's wonderful they're all out there, but then it starts to impact the area and become not only an unpleasant experience, but impacts the water quality and the vegetation that's there. So if you start to think of leave no trace as a spectrum, on one end, there's very many impacts, on others, there's very few. So there are many ways to leave no trace when you're spending time outdoors. So you want to find what your place is on the spectrum. Doing anything to minimize your impact is better than doing nothing at all. But it's about doing what we can to minimize our impact on the natural spaces where we choose to spend our time. So if you've packed out your trash, you've left no trace. If you've picked up after your pet, you've left no trace. And if you've done both, even better. So it's a cumulative effect of all the good stewardship actions is how we collectively protect our shared lands. So if you think of the difference on our public lands, is every person put at least one principle of leave no trace into action and really what the impact could be. So this is just a reminder of the 7 principles of leave no trace. And now I'm going to go through some of the ones that are specific to Concord that we have found that are issues and that we're trying to have more education about and make sure people that understand that are going out there. So pack it in, pack it out, always bring your trash out with you. One of the biggest problems is improperly disposing of food waste. So throwing apple cores in the woods, I know you think it's going to degrade, but that starts to attract wildlife. So then they start to become a nuisance, and we don't want to proliferate that issue. We specifically choose where the trails are going to go to avoid wildlife habitat, let them stay where they're going to stay, let the humans be where they're going to be. But by starting to introduce that food that attracts them, you're starting to cause that conflict, and the humans are always going to win because the wildlife will, become more of a nuisance, and human safety is what we're looking for mostly. So we want to make sure that we don't want to have that wildlife coming to these areas where we're trying to enjoy. So it alters their natural behaviors. It exposes them to predators and other dangers. So it starts to bring them out of where they would normally go. You'll often hear about birds like raptors, hawks, bald eagles that will get hit on the side of the road. And you wonder, how does a bird get hit on the side of the road? It's because someone has thrown food out the window and they're coming to get it, and then they get hit by a car because that food has brought them to this dangerous situation when they normally would not have gone. So it's not necessarily about attracting wildlife and being afraid that it's going to make you feel less safe. We want to make sure that the wildlife remains safe. Dog waste, that's one of the biggest issues that we have identified on the trails. When the snow melts after winter, because nobody will pick up their dog poop on the trail in the winter, it's disturbing. Some of the more heavily used trails, the first 200 feet will just be, hundreds of piles of dog waste. And it's not only an unpleasant experience for people out there, but it's very unhealthy for the environment. There's harmful bacteria that's found in dog waste, Giardia. There's other fecal bacteria that some may argue, oh, dog waste is natural. It's not. If a coyote poops in the woods, it's eating what was in that forest. So it's more natural there to return that to the forest. A dog is not eating the berries or the other materials that it's finding in the forest. It's being fed very nutrient-dense foods. It's perhaps on some sort of medication. I know my dog is always on some form of antibiotic or something. So they're starting to introduce pharmaceuticals in that waste to areas that we wouldn't necessarily be introduced by wild animals. So it's starting to introduce excess nutrients. And then just the quantity of waste from thousands of visitors to the popular parks can have a profound impact on water quality. And those excess nutrients will, once it rains, it'll bring those nutrients into the local pond, lake, or river, and you can have algal blooms, which start to shade out and cause oxygen issues for the fish and the insects that live within the water itself. So it could really have a profound effect on water quality. Again, it's not just you say, all right, it's my dog, it was one pile of dog poop, but if you have 1,000 people saying that same thing, oh, it was just this one time, that cumulative impact is what we're looking at, and that's the big problem. And then this is my favorite thing, the people that hang their, I don't know if you've seen the dog waste that gets hung on the tree or left on the rock. Oh, I'll just come back and get it later. Or this bag is compostable. The thing about the compostable bags is that they're only compostable at commercial facilities. They're not compostable in the woods. So at that point, it's, you know, it doesn't help at all. You should have just, might as well have just left it, because now you've introduced plastic into the environment instead of just dog waste. So just a reminder to always bring your dog waste out. I mean, I made the mistake once of leaving it in my trunk for 24 hours and walking in that smell. I will never make that mistake again. But I've seen people, and I just thought yesterday I wanted to take a picture, people will put it on their rear windshield wiper when they're driving home to get it home so you don't have to smell it in your car, but it's just hanging off the back of their vehicle. Just be a responsible dog owner and take their waste with you. So dogs on leash, this is a user conflict issue. Not all dogs are friendly or predictable towards other humans or other pets. I used to have a reactive dog. I always had him on leash, and off-leash dogs would come running towards us and they'd yell, oh, he's friendly, it's fine. And I'd say, but my dog is not. And that was a constant anxiety that I had, where we just didn't want to take our dogs on the trails anymore because we didn't want any harm to those dogs that were rushing us, because we knew our dog was reactive. But we had him on a leash because we knew we didn't want him going towards anybody. So it's that unpredictable behavior that can cause issues. Dogs also have the potential to disrupt, stress, harm, or even kill local wildlife. So that's another wildlife impact that we're looking at. So while within the city of Concord on conservation properties, dogs currently are not required to be on leash. We request that you keep dogs on leash just as to be courteous to other trail users, and then it just makes the site potentially more safer for wildlife. Because we've had more trail use over the last year, we've heard a lot more about conflicts and requests to make an ordinance to change it to make leashes required. That's a city council action. It hasn't gotten any movement yet, but we'll see what happens in the future. And then staying on that durable surface, so staying on the marked trail. So rogue trail building is one of our bigger issues that we're having right now as well. We have 85 miles of trails, but it's not enough. People want to make their own trails. People will make the trails that connect to their own private property, or mountain bikers just see something that looks more interesting, or runners. So the problem with that is you start to have issues. It erodes the trust between the trail users and property owners. So it makes you as a property owner, us, the city, or the private property owner, upset, because it's very disrespectful to your property. You've been given permission to be here, but it's not enough, so you're just going to keep taking. It can cause safety concerns for trail users and abutters. When we're designing a trail, we put a lot of planning into it. So if you're not planning it, you can create chaotic trail networks that are hard to follow and navigate, and increase the difficulty of rescue operations in the event of an incident. So just last week, somebody had built an illegal trail on private property that connected to one of our city trails. It was blocked off, but a mountain biker went on the trail anyways and was coming fast down a hill and hit the tree that the property owner had used to block the trail and got severely injured. And then, they called out the city, why are you blocking trails? But it wasn't us, it was the private property owner, but that trail shouldn't have been there to begin with. So that's an issue that was sort of an extreme issue of what happens when you start using these rogue trails. And then we had another person, unfortunately, she passed away. There was a rogue trail that was built to a view on private property that people had discovered and they had started going out to. And she ended up having a cardiac incident, and the fire department couldn't get up there quickly enough. She ended up passing away. It was very unfortunate. But when we have our trails mapped out, the fire department has all the trails GPSed, so they know where to go with their UTV to rescue people. But if you're starting to go out on trails that don't exist in our system, they can't respond quickly enough. So that's another problem that happens when people build these illegal trails. The wildlife impacts also are a huge consideration. When we build them, they are located to avoid environmentally sensitive areas, including vernal pools and areas of known wildlife use. This is harkens back to the story I just told about the herons, where we specifically did not put that trail next to the beaver pond, but people built it and people started walking out there anyways, and now we've destroyed that habitat. And the issue is that once the trail is established, it's very difficult to stop people from using it. And so, and now with open source mapping, so I don't know if people know what Strava is. I just learned about a new one called Trail Forks that people use because they're apps on their phone, they're easily accessible, and anybody can put a trail on there. And if you look at that and overlay what our legal trails are, there's hundreds of miles of trails in Concord, and we only have 85 that are legally built. So it's definitely an issue that, but because it's out there on the internet, it's really difficult to stop people from using those. So just how to get involved into spreading the leave no trace principles. Step one, which you're doing tonight, is to learn. This is just sort of a snippet, just a sort of a quick overview of the principles and why it's important. But there's a lot of resources online. I'll have a link later on, but education is the hugest, biggest component, I think, in any of this. So join any volunteer groups, leave no trace. There's a group called Nature Groupie, and they just did a 4-day trash cleanup volunteer. So you went out on your own, and I just saw a statistic over 4 days, 80 people picked up 1,600 pieces of trash. So there's groups like that, even during COVID times when you're not getting together in groups, you can do it on your own, just report back. But that's one way to join in and sort of help pick up. Somebody said, great, before this started, you're picking up the traces that other people left behind. So I think that's great. So educate people, join in and try to spread the word, but also do your part and pass it on. So anything that you learned tonight, or if you share this recording, just pass on information that you learn about why it's so important to follow these principles and really lessen your impact. Because again, it's that cumulative impact that either really damages things or can make things better. And then just enjoy your world, leave no trace. So really enjoy the outdoors. It's amazing. We have great places to go to, and just do your best to keep it that way for your generations to come. So you can find more information at leavenotracelnt.org. If you want information about Concord Trails, concordnh.gov/trails, or this is my contact information. If you have any questions for me in the future. And I don't know if there's any questions now, but that was my presentation.
There is one question in the chat, which is, when are the facilities open at Sewell? When are the facilities open at Sewell Falls open?
That I don't know. Sewell Falls is a fish and game site. So the state maintains that. And I'm not sure when they start opening those up. Usually, I think May timeframe.
There are no other questions in the chat, but Beth has her hand up.
Yeah, I'm just very curious as I'm listening to you with this presentation, and also I attended the last one that you did just a couple of weeks ago. I found myself wondering what your background is that brought you to do this work.
I have a very circuitous route to get here. I started out after college as an environmental scientist. I did a lot of environmental consulting work. And then I got my master's degree in landscape architecture. And my specialty was ecological restoration. And I did a lot of work on, I worked down in Massachusetts for the city of Cambridge on their watershed properties. So they had these lands that were protecting their drinking water source. Cambridge is the only city east of Worcester that doesn't get its water from the Quabbin Reservoir, and they're very proud of that. So, but they have to really protect that water resource. So I can't remember how many acres off the top of my head they had, but I helped them with the management of that. But there was a lot of recreational pressure on it as well, because there wasn't a lot of open space in the Boston area. So it was balancing recreation use, ecological restoration, and water protection. So that used my environmental science background and my landscape architecture background. And then I got burnt out with the private sector and now work for the city of Concord. And I'm trying to use those skills that I learned as a private consultant for 15 years to come together and kind of build up the program within the city of Concord.
That's great. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. You went from Cambridge, sort of in the city, and then sort of headed further away.
Yep.
Thank you.
Smaller city. There's another question, which is, and this is from Carol, will any of the trails connect with the Hannah Dustin Trail? So Carol, do you want to expand on that, or is that good enough?
Yeah, I grew up here in Concord when I was a kid. I used to run across Sewell Falls to get to West Concord as a kid. So I know a lot of the trails. I've done the trails up behind Concord Hospital, which are excellent. I knew that when it was St. Paul's ski area. But hopefully from the bottom of the state all the way up to Lebanon, we're supposed to have a connecting trail.
Yep. That is, the city council is currently in negotiations. Pan Am owns the railroad corridor. So if we can purchase that, which fingers crossed, that's something that we can do, then yes, that trail, that will become a trail that will connect from pretty much all through Concord up to Lebanon.
Beth, I'm curious. I know that right now you're not doing this, but I know that you do hikes. You take people out on hikes, but it's not COVID. Have you incorporated or plan to incorporate Leave No Trace into the hikes?
We would like to, yes, definitely. We have, so Bob Holdsworth is his name. I don't know if anybody's ever met him, but he was our state advocate for Leave No Trace. And he was always very busy to do that, but he said he has just recently retired from that position. So he's still involved, but doesn't have as much time. So I'm hoping that he can lead a hike or lead a couple. He's very interested in that. So yes, that would be ideal because he's very knowledgeable.
I don't have anything else in the chat, but Mary has her hand up. So Mary, unmute Mary. It's our joke.
Thank you, Iris.
You're welcome.
I'm just curious because you did show a picture of someone camping out, on the trails. Do they have to get permission from the city of Concord to camp out, or do people just do that arbitrarily?
So that picture was actually for the Leave No Trace. We do not allow camping on city property.
Okay.
Some private, in the past, like if you were with a group, so we've allowed the Boy Scouts, like a group of Boy Scouts, to do an overnight camping and they get a permit from the city. But other groups, if that was something that they were interested in doing, they could get a permit. But individual overnight camping, I know it happens, people do it, but it's not legal.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things, I try to get the word out there in case you know someone that's illegally doing it, at least tell them to be a little more responsible about it, just so we don't have the fires that we have had.
Anything else?
Well, we certainly want to thank you, Beth, for sharing your time and your expertise with us tonight. I certainly found it helpful. I did learn several things, especially about some of the more hazardous outcomes from leaving what you think might be innocent trash. And thank you to those of you attending for joining us this session. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Leave No Trace principles in sustainable trails, and that the information and the resources will be of value to you. And please make sure that you check out the rest of our AARP New Hampshire offerings on our website at aarp.org/NH for more online programs coming soon, such as Coffee and Conversation, Gentle Yoga, cooking demonstrations, and much, much more. So be well and take care, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Dexter says he
Thank you.
thoroughly enjoyed your presentation as he sat at the edge. He's like, hello. Like, that was interesting.
When am I gonna get out on the trail, he's saying.
It's like, let's go for a hike,
Beth.
Mom.
Put them on a leash.
Thank you so much, Beth. We really
All right.
appreciate it, and we'll be in touch again.
All right, thanks.
Great.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Same here. Where are we?